NBC's Vaughn Hilliard is reporting from West Palm Beach, Florida. Also with us, former Republican Congressman from Florida, David Jolly, an MSNBC political analyst, and Eugene Daniels, Politico's White House correspondent and Playbook co-author and an MSNBC political contributor. So the minute this happened, Vaughn, I was thinking about it. I think it was just this past Sunday when Don Jr. was asked about what if somebody, doesn't make it through. And he said, we've got backup plans for every position. We have lists of 10 or 12 people. Right? We just heard Ken Dilanian report that a legal ally who has helped with the transition added the names of Senator Mike Lee of Utah, Chris Landau, a former ambassador to Mexico. So what do we know about this list? And is there a clear frontrunner?
Right. Do you turn to somebody like Mark Paoletta, who is another legal advisor who's been helping this transition and somebody who has been at the forefront of arguing that Donald Trump's DOJ should be operated not as some independent faction from the White House, but somebody a DOJ that should take the directions of Donald Trump. And so, yet somebody who also doesn't have the baggage of Matt Gaetz and may not have the bombast or the name recognition or draw quite the same level of scrutiny. But I think that's where you could see him going potentially in a direction like that. But you said Mike Lee, of course, the senator from Utah, who has remained a close ally. But if you want to get Mike Lee, well, clearly Matt Gaetz fell. His nomination fell because of a very narrow Republican majority, one in which they need every guaranteed Republican senator, which Mike Lee all but is for these cast of nominees from Donald Trump. So if you lose Mike Lee, well, you may lose his vote for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. or Pete Hegseth, and that may be a sacrifice they're unwilling to take. You named Matt Whitaker, was somebody who we had reported for a week at that point as being up for consideration, but literally just yesterday he was nominated to be the ambassador to NATO. And so that's where suddenly this for Donald Trump becomes a little more difficult. You could have Todd Blanche, who he's nominated to be his deputy AG, potentially be nominated to be his AG instead. But this really, I think, is a clear blow to Donald Trump and his transition right now, that anybody that he puts forward is not necessarily going to get a free pass by the Republican majority in the Senate.
Well, Eugene, of course, our good friend Vaughn brings up something really interesting, which is the very narrow majority. But we saw it over in the House, right? The speaker goes to Donald Trump and says, hey, don't keep stealing my people. I don't have very many of them, right? So now we're talking about Mike Lee, and Senator Eric Schmidt is the new name that went in. I mean, would he care? Would that be high on his priority list? I wonder what you make of this, or whether the two people who we mentioned, who are Whitaker and Ratcliffe, has been picked to lead the CIA. Could they be back in the mix? Could he change his mind? Is anything possible, I guess, is my question.
If we've learned anything since Donald Trump entered the political world, is that anything is possible, right? I think Todd Blanche is one that folks should keep their eyes on. As Vaughn just said, he is very close to Trump, one of his lawyers in one of his many legal cases. I think at the end of the day, what we've seen is that even Donald Trump has a kind of a pain point, right? It was very clear for a very long time, from second one, that Gaetz would have an uphill climb. And once he got on and talked to a bunch of these senators, Donald Trump himself had been leaning on a bunch of senators, and it just became clear that this wasn't going to work. And Donald Trump, even though he is someone who does feel like he has the power over the Republican Party, and he's right to a certain extent, he seems to have listened at this point to some of those senators and some of their concerns. That also means that there's probably a world in which Senator Thune talks to him and says, look, please don't take any senators from me. I'm begging you, let me have my people so that we can deal with everything else. Because they do have a longer list of folks who wouldn't be taken out of the Senate. And some of these people may not want to go through the entire process of being vetted by the Judiciary Committee and going to the hearing with folks that they work with.
Well, I mean, yeah, and I wonder, even going beyond that, you have to make a decision about whether you want to be a part of this administration, right?
Yeah, and I mean, and that tells you a lot, right? The folks who maybe aren't so interested, because despite the fact that they're going to have this trifecta, it is still going to be very hard to get things done, right? And if you are a member of the cabinet, the way that Donald Trump works is a little different if people haven't noticed than most presidents work, right? So if he wants something done, he's going to demand that the Secretary of X, Y, and Z, the Attorney General, gets it done. And bureaucracy, despite the fact that they're going to try to dismantle it in some ways, it still is going to move very slow. So some of those things aren't going to happen at the speed at which Donald Trump is going to want that. And is that something that these folks who have good careers, who have good futures, want to put themselves through for 2 to 4 years before they, Mike Lee's someone who you could see running for president at some time. Do you come in and lose some of the power that you have in order to do that?
So, Congressman, Democratic Senator Chris Murphy told NBC News about Gates's withdrawal, quote, "It's good for democracy, but who comes next? It could get worse." Sure. What do you think the likelihood of that is? Or we also know Donald Trump likes to win, right? I'm sure he's not happy that he did not win this one. He was making calls himself, and the folks at Mar-a-Lago were confirming that he was working the phones on behalf of Matt Gaetz. So will he look potentially, given the number of names on this list, for someone with the credentials to get through?
Yeah, I do think so. Look, this is a major embarrassment for President-elect Donald Trump, a major embarrassment for J.D. Vance, the vice president-elect, who had personally been lobbying for Matt Gaetz. This is a massive loss for the incoming president, and he has to feel it right now. It also reflects the importance of Susie Wiles in this process. It's been widely reported that this was a surprise to Susie Wiles, that she was left out of this conversation. And in some ways, I think this incident probably foreshadows what we're dealing with over the next 4 years. When Donald Trump makes decisions with brashness with some of the lesser qualified advisors to him and ignores the counsel of, say, a Susie Wiles, we end up with a situation like this. Now, I think I disagree a little bit with Chris Murphy on this, because I don't think it can get worse. And here's what I mean by that. All of the names available to Donald Trump will do his bidding. He is not going to nominate somebody that now refuses to do his bidding. In many ways, Bill Barr did his bidding really until a falling out at the end. But if you consider Bill Barr came on to obfuscate the Mueller report and to fix what had gone wrong in Donald Trump's eyes, not in the eyes, say, of the Constitution, Bill Barr was a henchman for Donald Trump in many ways. Donald Trump has a different priority that he wants his AG to go after now, an enemies list. He wants to indeed make the Department of Justice a tool of the executive office of the president. Many nominees potentially could do that, including U.S. senators. I think what we were spared in this case is a nominee wholly unqualified. Both Matt Gaetz's experience, it lacks qualification for the job, and then the questions of his personal fitness with the very substantive allegations of sexual misconduct with a minor. Those probably will be eliminated from the potential next nominee. Donald Trump's going to get his person, and his person will be confirmed and do his bidding, and we're in a new era for the Department of Justice. We know that. But I think of the other names that are being spoken of, they're probably qualified to run the department.
So I wonder who, Vaughn, might have the president-elect's ear on this. Will it be one of the nominees themselves, who happens to be the last person at Mar-a-Lago and makes what he considers a good case, and then he makes a decision? Maybe there's also a question about, are there people on this list who are generally more popular or have more support among the people who might have his ear, whether it's his sons? I don't know. Elon Musk, you tell me.
Right. And I think that this is an important conversation to have, because I think it's not just representative of the transition, but it's going to be representative of this White House, very likely. Because the way, we talked about this a lot, Chris, the way that he ran his 2024 campaign was by having a very small nucleus of advisors who were very much trusted. Susie Wiles, Chris LaCivita, Jason Miller, Boris Epshteyn. Again, this is a very small nucleus that Donald Trump placed trust in, as well as Don Jr., who took a much more active role in personnel. But we've seen Elon Musk be added into the fold here, and Howard Lutnick. So it's grown a little bit. But I think that Donald Trump's decision to choose Matt Gaetz in the first place, when he was on an airplane with Matt Gaetz to Mar-a-Lago, was, I think, the head turner that this is Donald Trump's decision-making process. And even if it's on a whim, he's going to make the selection that who he feels most comfortable with, right? There's Andrew Bailey, the Missouri Attorney General, whose name is also in the mix. But I think what we have seen with these numerous selections is that Donald Trump has had several names thrown his direction, but then ultimately makes the decisions in ways that are not necessarily choreographed or even foreseen by a great many people who are definitely his allies in and around Mar-a-Lago, but in Washington, D.C. too. So there's only so much guessing that can take place because Donald Trump is clearly instinctively making these selections in real time in ways that I think could be very indicative of how we could expect his White House to run come January 2025 too.